suggest that I want you just to flag the fact that that this kind of approach can be used to. This slide is about the fact that you can have this much more general. I mean, there's actually no need to do this linear technology necessarily either. I just wrote it that way here. But the point here is to basically say that we could have liquidation, which is reflected here in this equation. You see that this is how much continuous. You could have a liquidation value. I'm sorry for the W's of L here. This is not liquidity. This is actually liquidation value. I should have chosen a different letter. The remainder goes liquidated. So this is presumably something higher than this, but well. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's not. This is a continuous liquidity shock, and that may trigger liquidation as being a better option. And you could have a shock to, just the cash flow that you get from that's independent of the scale, and it could be this is in there because sometimes we want to ask whether we want to insure things or not insure. So think of this as a sort of random shock to cash from something. Your factory burns down, or something happens that you need that's unrelated, not so much to the scale, that's not the point, but it's unrelated to what you do. So here is a shock that somehow interacts with a decision, and here is a shock that doesn't interact with a decision. And one of the things when you do the simple Lagrangian here, you see that things depend. Well, this is of course a term that we have used, but in particular you see here that there is things depend just actually on the different this particular term Z0 minus Z minus L. So you can see that this they don't independently depend on the shocks. They enter all in the same way in this particular technology, at least, and so you see that it's a matter of how much is the Lagrange multiplier on this constraint here on one hand, and then secondly what happens to the pledgeable income minus the shock minus the opportunity cost of continuing, which is this liquidation value. So this is a cost, this is opportunity cost, and this is the benefit from continuing, and that in the end determines in what states do you continue and what states don't you. The one thing I wanted to point out is a couple of things actually. One of which is, first of all, this you could deal with these things much more generally, but secondly, if you get a shock to the system, it has no effect, it just enters as an expected value here. So that you don't, this is, if you think about risk management, in the view of this model, risk management is really about how much investment can we do, and can we do the right kinds of investment. So this kind of conceptual thinking, which actually dates back to Fruit, Scharfstein and Stein has a paper on risk management, which starts off in a way that it's not obvious what they are doing, but in the end they come to a very general model that basically saying the way you handle risk management is you equalize the marginal value of liquidity across states. So that's the right mindset to keep it. People think about risk management for all sorts of reasons. Here it's all about, again, let's make sure we have liquidity in the right states. And if you have a very general model like Fruit and Scharfstein have, they just write in the end, profit is a function of how much liquidity I have in that state, and then the state itself. So they kind of, in reduced form, it's a trivial model, and you conclude that the way you ideally would like to insure yourself is that the marginal value of liquidity is equalized, where liquidity really is how much money do you need for these kind of continuation investments. And this is just one example of a model that I have presented here, but it has exactly this feature that liquidity management is risk management, is liquidity management, which means let's make sure we can continue to do the things we want to do that are valuable. It's true that the marginal return is usually higher, or is demanded to be higher than what it is in the market, but still they should be ideally equalized across states. And therefore a financial shock, that comes in here, just forget about, that just we always ensure that fully. So let me take just as an example a question. You can ask a question about, suppose I just always get in some cash from, I don't know, think of it as a lottery. That thing, I should really always sell that lottery. I should not have because that's a variation in the amount of liquidity I have, but I really don't want it to be just a random variation in liquidity. That's not a good thing for me. So I should have some. That is one way of thinking about why corporations provide insurance. Buy insurance against sort of random events. But if we take the example of a fire, that's a different example, because the fire, you have actually, if your factory burns down, you have actually the option of not building it again, in principle. So, it could be that the factory, if it burns down, I shouldn't actually build it. That's not desirable. So that's an example of a shock really that isn't in this linear fashion, but it's kind of like a liquidity shock that interacts with the decision. And so in the end, people have written a lot about this hedging and so on, and they have kind of mechanical models about it. Fruit, Schaffstein, Stein, and we are in the same tracks, basically pointing out that in some ways, you need to think always about what you are going to do with these monies. And that it makes a difference if the shock is such that it has implications on what you decide to do, such as the factory burning down. That's a very different case for something like it's just a random income. You have say some randomness in your portfolio. So it sort of speaks, for instance, to the idea that you should keep things in very safe instruments, because any variable instrument that's not something that interacts with your decision directly. You can't if you make a high return or low return in the stock market as a company, that's not the same thing as a factory of yours burning down, because you can't decide anything. This is just a random income stream of the type that the Y represents there. And the answer is don't have it random. It's basically that's one way. It's a little simplistically said, because sometimes in order to get your position secure, you want to hedge, so you may actually go into some random items just to eliminate some other kind of randomness. That's the flavor. That's one way of thinking about it. And the key thing to take away is that actually you have to think about the value of money for the purposes of making these decisions, or the value of liquidity. When you think about hedging, and there's a lot of, from this perspective, because it's the only reason. I go back again in the standard model, there just isn't a reason for liquidity. So you got to sort of pick up a model that has liquidity, and in this model, and in Schaffstein, Stein, any actually of the corporate finance models that we have, basically you find that it comes down to understanding what decision consequences there are for this hedging. That you have to kind of go and dig underneath and look. And I think Fruit Schaffstein Stein this is a very good way of thinking about it. The optimal hedging or liquidity management problem is about making sure that the return on liquidity in each state, if possible, is the same. The marginal value. It's that simple. And here in this model we can write, of course, explicit equations as soon as you put explicit equations. I asked Jeremy Stein, I thought this was a brilliant article. I think it's a greatly underappreciated article in the sense that the really deep stuff comes at the end, and there's always a danger when you start with something first and then people don't read, section 6. Don't ever put anything important in section 6, because they just are not going to get there. So he said, yes, he's always thought of it the same way. He thought this was really something very insightful that they learned, and he has noticed that people cite it, but sort of for the wrong reason, because they're making, that they haven't understood. So he was pretty excited. He was very happy to see that we had kind of hit on the same button that he thought was part of the essence of what is is interesting in this manner. And I should say, by the way, we have a paper of liquidity management, but that paper does not reflect this understanding. You know, that's what happens when you rush out the paper. You know, you eventually learn what really is the key point and this interaction thing. So keep in mind this difference between a factory burning down, you know, that you may not want to actually insure fully. And then on the other side, you know, something that's purely a financial shock. Yes.
Right. Yeah. You're right.
So now I just wanted to. I don't think I will go back to the blackboard, but I will say a few words more if I have the time. I certainly will not keep you over time this time, but I will about the modeling itself. But let this be a plug for. I don't think I gave Andre the reference, but I can. Yes, but you can look at it. It's a Journal of Finance paper in I don't know, maybe early 90s, something like that. But it has liquidity in the title. So now I want to go back to this international savings. So Andre Schleifer was actually the first, as I said, who, when you heard this talk many years ago, he said, well, do I understand it correctly that your theory hinges on the idea that there isn't enough savings instruments, you know, so that, you know, Thailand or Finland or whatever small country ends up in a problem because somehow these people can't find a place to save. He said, well, don't you think that, you know, the US or the global markets have sort of trillions of dollars where the Finns could put their money, and so how is it possible that their kind of problem could relate to this? And if so, you know, it seems to me that they are, and they put it a little more nicely, but, you know, basically, you know, this is just, this is a nice little model, but it has no relevance because this problem shouldn't exist. So it was a very serious issue to kind of address. That's from the modeling point of view. It's really important to address the question of what's the problem with going to international markets? For, you might call it collateral or savings instruments, you know, the things that secure that the investor, no, let me again emphasize, it is about a rich Finn, a rich consumer, you know, has a lot of you know, consumption income right now. His problem is that he can't move it till tomorrow because there aren't enough savings instruments in Finland, or, you know, that's kind of the problem. But right now he has actually a good cash flow. Why can't he just take that cash flow and, you know, invest abroad and then buy, you know, treasury bonds, so U.S. treasury bonds, very safe, and we will come back, the money will be cashed out. So, you know, just go outside, try and save there and come back in when it is, and then if you take the risk aspect into account as well, then it's a matter of, you know, treasury bonds don't fluctuate against the Finnish market, so we get risk sharing. You know, so what's wrong with that? And the answer is something that it didn't take that long to figure out, is that you know, we are back, when it comes to this question, we are actually back to the first problem again, thinking of Finland as a corporation, you know, that has only so much pledgeable foreign assets. You see that the key idea is that Finland may have a lot of cash flow, but a lot of it is also totally uninteresting to foreigners. So if we didn't produce anything that, you know, take the extreme case where we don't produce anything that Americans or whoever, you know, the international guys want, we just are completely shut out of the international market because we don't have anything to offer to buy, you know, to buy the bond with. So it's actually a very simple answer. You know, we better have dollars. You know, we better produce, let's put it this way, goods that are tradable, so that we can use those tradable goods to buy those dollar securities. Otherwise, we are out of it. And that's actually the kind of important, the simple answer, but it leads to the idea of that's really have been pushed by Caballero and Krishnamurti in a sequence of papers, which is you need to make a difference or distinction between what is they call international collateral, which foreigners are willing to, take as payment for instruments or as security, as collateral for loans to Finland and so on. And of course, any small country like Finland knows that. That's what we have lived of. I mean, we have always pushed the export sector because we know when we push the exports, we are kind of increasing our wealth in some, it's like we are earning real income as opposed to just internal income, which is sort of plain money in the big world. So that's what's very natural. So I hope, now that we are this small, I want to, you understand this thing. Then there is also domestic collateral, which is I'm producing, I have a business that it's a laundry business, so I wash shirts, and that has a value also because Finns will pay for that. But the American is totally uninterested in this aggregate sense of, you're not going to invest in this. If all we have is laundry, Finnish laundry, the American will never come in here. Because yes, he can invest in it, but he never will be able to get anything out of it. In the end, for all the exchange rates, the simple way of thinking about the world is that you always pay with goods. And it better be goods that people accept. That's one variant of the international domestic collateral distinction. And I will present a little model with that. There is another variant of it that is equally interesting and not inconsistent, which is international people cannot get the hands, either they don't understand as well or they can't get the hands on collateral to the extent that the Finns can. So if I go into France and I try to look, I'm thinking about, should I sort of, I'm supposed to invest in something and the guy is offering me, some chateau somewhere. I have no idea what the chateau is worth or, what it may entail and so on. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. Or he has a French business, or I don't know the habits. You see, you're just naturally reluctant to step in because there is some kind of information gap. It's not the moral hazard model I put on, but it is something. And, but the bottom line is that, again, that wedge that I can't get pledged, for me, the French wedge is much bigger than for Tyrol, who understands, at least, that another way of looking at it, there are 100 assets in this business that I'm supposed to invest, and I may understand one of them. And Tyrol understands 50 of them. So his sort of, what's pledgeable income to Tyrol, a local guy, is very different than what it is to a foreigner like me. So there is the distinction that we have emphasized, and we will work more on it, and I think is very exciting, is what you might just call local liquidity versus, it's kind of a niche, and that can occur even within the United States. So this very issue, I think, is very relevant for the fact that how is it that Florida suddenly gets, big, problematic kind of drops in their what you might call GDP, or Florida. And it's not an exchange rate issue because there is no exchange rate, but it has to do, or could have to do, with actually significant differences in, even within a country, how that local network understands things versus the general population. And so, in some sense, how wealthy you are has a lot to do with how many people know and understand what you are doing. If you are the only guy who understands you have a brilliant idea, well, first of all, it could be wrong, the understanding. Most of the time it is. But suppose it is actually a brilliant idea. Until, a lot of people understand it, it won't become money. Or at least until somebody with money. And money, by the way, is very liquid because everybody understands about it. There's no asymmetric information, there's no cutting the paper, and you see that it's an issue of who knows what in the end, how wealthy you are. And so that's one reason of having wealthy friends, because not only can you sometimes borrow from them, but actually they may understand your wealth better than other people. So if you need, so that's critical for the borrower. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture, is that we are taking the little step of saying that, this, I hesitate to draw this, but this cake actually is more interesting because it actually has this is the local guy, and then for the non-local or the foreigner, the slice. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. For the local guy, the pledgeable income can look this big, and for the foreigner, it can be, it is smaller. So that's another way of thinking about it. In the international context, you can do it with tradable versus non-tradable goods, which is kind of a clean way. People are a little more skeptical about thinking of this case, but I think actually this is a very simple and useful way of. It just illustrates how simply this model works, and it's also something that I think is going to come into use when people apply these models. By the way, this kind of local globe idea is one that is in our QJ 97 paper, where we have monitors. We have monitors who know more about prospects or can control the moral hazard problem, and therefore the cake changes its size. Okay. So I'm going to talk about two models that are somewhat different, and it may not make that much of a difference to you because if you haven't seen any of this literature. But people who have seen the literature might sometimes be confused about it. The first model is from a small model from a paper in the AER, or Papers and Proceedings model, which literally is looking at the question of how much can foreigners contribute through the international collateral to what I'm doing. And then the second model is a paper by Caballero and Krishnamurthy, which is looking at a more specific question, using the same instrument of international versus domestic, but looking at the question of why is it that there's a tendency of underinvesting in foreign insurance, that in dollars. The flip of it is, why is it that small countries borrow way too much in dollars? They should actually borrow less or perhaps even invest in dollars. But it's going to be a story about why they underinvest in insurance, which is a precursor to the fact that that's one of the reasons they get into a crisis more easily than they should. So here is the setup. It's the same, there's three periods going to be always. There are now two types of agent, or two nationalities, foreigners and domestics. There are, in this model, that I'm now talking about the AER, the paper with Tirol, they're going to be tradable and non-tradable goods. We are going to call them, dollar goods, and that's the tradable good, and then we have I know Mexicans here, so I call them pesos. I used to call them marks, but we don't have marks. It's just euros, and I don't want to insult the bigger population with euros. So dollar goods and pesos, but understand there's no money in this model. In none of the models you have seen is there any money, but still there is. This is just a shortcut. And the preference is for and all the dollar goods are starred. I could have put a dollar, but they're going to be starred. And international consumers only value the dollar goods. So their preferences are just like before, except they operate only on consumption of the dollar goods. And the domestics are, just to make matters simple, they are actually indifferent between dollar goods and peso goods. Obviously, this is not what the world looks like, but it's just a simple way of getting certain things, equal. It's not essential for the storyline. And then there are endowments, A and A's. I understand now why international trade is not so popular. It has high returns to become a professional international trade because there's always a shortage of international trade. But the hurdle is that the notation is horrible. Nobody wants to carry out. You have two goods, everything is always doubled. And if you have three countries, suddenly you have three things of everything. And it's just,
It starts, and then how do you?
Stars is not our invention.
No, the trade guys use stars.
Yeah.
And we want stars for first best.
It's just, this thing, it's hard even to do examples. So I'm going to do two simple. One of the things is you could have pesos and dollars in your production function at date 0, at date 1. You could produce dollars and pesos in some other combination at date 2. You see, it just gets out of hand in some sense. So we are going to go with, in this case, we are just going to assume all investments are in pesos. And there is a reason for why I'm assuming all, because I'm going to address the Schleifer question. So I'm going to make sure that dollars have no role in, I'm going to make things hard for me in the sense that I'm not going to make dollars necessary for production. So the only role for foreigners is going to be that they happen to have dollar savings instruments. And so I'm going to go and do the production function that looks like just like before, but there's this I, so this is not dollar goods, it's pesos going into Z of IC just like before. And then the only thing is I have to, make this Z0 and Z0 star IZ. So it is critical that some of the goods that are being produced, well, it's not essential because I have some initial, dollars here, but it's natural to have that this produces actually some export goods, this technology. When we go to the Caballero Krishnamurti paper, you'll see just the reverse. That's going to be an example where dollar goods are needed. It actually, therefore, is not an illustration about accessing foreign markets solely for the purpose of accessing insurance. That's the critical point I want to make. This is kind of really exactly targeting the Schleifer question of why it is that. And what we are going to, bottom line is going to be, A, you're going to see that yes, it's good to have access to international markets. So they can do something to alleviate the collateral, the savings problem. So basically reducing the cost of, it's going to mean that there's a reduction in the liquidity premium, sometimes maybe, down to 0. But secondly, there will usually be a role also for domestic markets. So it retains, in some sense, it justifies the fact that we left out the international market. In the end, this example shows one model, at least, where it isn't actually a big deal, because everything on the domestic side is going to still look the same as it did in the original model. Okay, so foreigners only. So what can be pledged here, just to make clear, is here for foreigners you can pledge C0 star I plus A star for foreigners, and then for domestics you can pledge C0 star for they take as collateral C0 this plus A. Notice that they will take the domestics, since they eat just as happy to eat American, McDonald's stuff or something, they will take it. So you see how this wedge is exactly larger. The foreign wedge is a subset. I'm sorry, the domestic wedge is a subset of the foreign wedge. And they accept a bigger part of the cake as collateral. Let me just put in here also, I just throw it in here, just so that there's a natural, I'm going to put government bonds, L and L star. So the domestic bonds could be just the kind of bonds we talked about. L star could be either bonds or they could be, some shares in the natural resources. We are talking Mexico, oil is an obvious example. There's something that the government owns and it can sell as a way of saving. So by the way, privatization is a very important means to also expand the aggregate liquidity. And so, for many reasons, I think Mexico should do something about the oil reserves, maybe not sell everything, but to 51%. Less discussed reason is actually the kind of liquidity it provides to the market. This kind of perverse looking, that an obligation actually is something that is a savings instrument for and can help investment. In that fashion. So with that, maybe I put in here also there's going to be a price Q and Q star for just in parallel with what we discussed before. That's the date zero price for a peso bond. This is a date zero peso price for a peso bond is Q, and the date zero peso price for either a dollar bond or something. Let's call it just a dollar bond, which happens to be in the hands of the government. So these are everything here is in peso prices. And then the interest rate internationally, I'm going to assume is zero. So they will. It's like before. The international market doesn't have any premiums of any sort, so that's zero. All right. So the representative firm choice is now to buy these liquidity, buy domestic bonds, buy dollar bonds, and then choose the initial level of investment and these continuation investments. So it's just like before. And there's a new thing here which is kind of a technicality, which is a way of dealing with you see that the role of the bond, the role of the foreigners and the dollar liquidity is going to be all about actually dealing with the domestic shock. See, this is a domestic shock here. It's not a dollar shock or anything. It's a domestic shock. So dealing with that shock, and T star Z is going to be about amount of dollar goods transferred into peso goods. Why can I do that at date 1? This is at date 1. I can do that because the consumers have sufficiently much, of peso goods, and they are just as happy if you give them a dollar good, they will take it and say, here's a peso good, because they are different between the C. You see, CT star and CT are just as good. So this is why I can, in the date 1 market, I can always, it's like saying the exchange rate in the date 1 market, by that assumption, is always equal to 1. A dollar good fetches a unit of peso good. There's no liquidity need at date 1 anymore. I mean, that's too late. If you haven't bought it earlier, it's not. You don't need dollar. You're not going to go buy dollars at date 1 anymore. It's not needed for anything. So that's by collecting this, by saving dollars. Here is how you put them into use. There are two things here. One of which is that you get the pesos you need for your investment, but also you'll see the T star Z. You can make it sensitive to Z in a fashion that's better, that expands on the risk-sharing opportunity from the domestic side alone. So here's the program. I'm practicing this program writing because I'm going to visit Rob Townsend at Chicago. And I don't know if you're familiar with Rob Townsend, but it's all about programs. Somewhat simple, but others, endlessly complicated. He's a big guy and always writing down the program that firms solve or the consumer solves or something. And I'm, by the way, in that very same school. And I think it's important to write down programs. Because a contract theorist understands things once you write down the program. But if you kind of give the model in piecemeal fashion, it's harder to understand. So here is a somewhat non-trivial program. It takes a little bit of thinking that this is actually the program that people solve, and I want to therefore comment on it and try to explain. So here is first of all the domestic budget constraint. I see. Is the left side. So here is what you spend on. This is going to be the peso budget constraint. I'm going to need I pesos for my investment. This is the cost of buying peso bonds. This is the cost of buying dollar bonds. This is how much I need to cover my liquidity shock. So this is all costs that I'm going to run. And this is for the domestic investor. And what can I offer the domestic investor? I can offer the pledgeable income. I can offer the T star Z. See, this is exactly the one place where transferring the T star Z here is to, satisfy the domestic investor. And then I, of course, get my bond value back, and then I have this is a representative firm, then I have the initial assets A that I can offer. So this is a little expansion with these two kind of goods. So that's the peso budget constraint for those investors. Then the dollar constraint, I'm going to spend now. This is where the transfer comes in. I'm going to spend this T star Z in stake C. I'm going to spend on buying pesos. In order to boost this peso budget constraint. That's one of the reasons, it's not the main reason. And then I'm going to get Z0 star IZ from output. And these are all expected values, these E's, in case I was floppy. And then, so here it is. So here's the dollar budget constraint. And notice that there's no direct expenditures in dollars at date 0, except that I have this idea. I'm going to write it in here. This is the date 1 expenditure. I'm going to have it as a transfer into the peso constraint. And then 3, I'm going to have IC less or equal to Z0 IC plus T star Z plus L. This is the liquidity constraint. This is the domestic. So this is for every C. And then there is a fourth constraint, which is 0 less or equal to IC. These are just the usual constraints, but here's an interesting fact, of course. T star Z got to be greater or equal to 0. Because you can move dollars into pesos, but you cannot move pesos into dollars. Because pesos into dollars, well, you could, of course, from the consumer, but the idea here is that I'm only moving dollars into pesos as no more than I need, so there's no excess, dollars floating around, and this is just, had I allowed this to be negative, then this country is supposedly creating dollars, and then they could access as much as they want, the international market. So this is really this is exactly ties in with the constraint that we don't have very many dollars. To begin with. This is how much dollar income we have, and that's what's going to constrain our access to the international market, and this is what I'm going to use it for. I'm going to use it in the budget, but even more importantly, this is really the critical thing. I can use the dollars here to supplement this liquidity shock. So if I didn't have access to that market, I would be just constrained to the fluctuation in the sea, and I couldn't do anything about it. The insurance possibilities would be much smaller than they are once I can actually also access the international market and get the T star C to work for me in terms of insurance. So that's the program. That's one way of writing down this program notice no international liquidity constraint. So you ask, why don't I have an international liquidity constraint? The reason is that the international market, by assumption, doesn't have a shortage of liquidity. That's the premise. I mean, presumably it does actually have it, and it has a slight premium, so the interest rate isn't what I wrote here, but I just made it zero, and there's no international liquidity constraint. That was Andre's presumption. Isn't there more than enough savings instruments globally? And the answer is yes. In this model, there is infinite amounts of saving instruments international. So never a liquidity constraint on the dollar. There's a budget constraint for the dollar, and that's what's going to constrain our access to the international thing. So this is kind of a neat little just illustration. I won't bore you very much with the details, but it turns out, first of all, that Q equals Q star. So this model runs itself so that I just described it. People will actually go and take some of the money and go and buy this international liquidity in order to be able to supplement this budget, but more importantly also to deal with the fluctuations in the liquidity shock, the domestic liquidity shock, getting the insurance from outside. That's the critical, really the aspect that's significant. Turns out that Q equals Q star because, first of all, of course, Q star, a dollar bond is at least as valuable as a peso bond because you can always transfer it into. But it turns out it's also no more valuable because the entrepreneur could go and buy a dollar, invest it in the dollar market, and get it. This also turns out to be equal to the zero exchange rate. So the date zero exchange rate. So dollars floating around in Mexico. If I want to, one route I have is to use my pesos at date zero, not to buy directly the dollar bond, but actually to go and buy dollars, in the A star stuff. And then take those, I have to pay E0 for it. It turns out that's equal to Q star. I go and buy with the dollars, and then I have a zero interest rate that I pay for the dollar bond internationally. So notice that this Q star, the international guys don't get a liquidity premium. The Americans, for once, don't get any money. It's the Mexican guy who has dollars that has access to all these firms. They are the ones that get this liquidity premium. So you'll see that the interest rate can be differential, be different from within the country as outside. Yeah.
Can you say again, just to clarify why the constraint number 2 is an expectation, so it's taken ex ante?
Because this is all a plan I'm making ex ante. You can think of it as I'm making this actually plan. Just forget about buy. I mean, we can buy these bonds, but another way of saying I'm just dealing with this. I'm dealing with an insurance agency. Oh, you are worried that why?
This is constraint on L star. So that's how we figure out what L star.
Yeah, but I'm going to assume that I'm buying the. You can think of it as these bonds that I'm buying here are just domestic bonds. This is the insurance I'm buying from the outside. So you see, I'm using these are the bonds that exist already in the country. So I'm paying pesos to get the government to give the oil bond to me. And then I take the oil bond and go and sell it to Sergey, who is half American. And that's how I get. And when I do that, I'm saying, Sergey, by the way, here is how I want to be repaid. I'm selling you this, and I'm buying the insurance here. So this is the insurance part. It's the insurance plan that I'm buying from the outsider. So the international guys are repaying in this stochastic manner rather than just the same amount that I gave them. I mean, you can have, it doesn't have to be an international guy that does it, it could be a domestic guy, that does the same.
I have a question about
By the way, we could stand here and talk for a fair amount of time. This is a non-trivial problem. So if you think it looks mysterious, it's not meant to be that way, but it is that way. So there is a fair amount of embedded, and the crux is always the same. People have a hard time, including ourselves for quite some time, always to think, what is a liquidity concept? It's that the investor cannot go and promise you the return. There is pesos around, or peso goods. It's just that at date zero, there isn't a way for them to committing to give you 1 million pesos when you need it. Because there's only 500,000 worth of asset value at that moment. In that state of nature, there's only 500,000 worth. That's the logic in this model. You could ask how could that be, but the rest of the liquidity is committed for other things, for consumers and other projects and so on.
Assume that zero star is equal to zero.
What is
Z
zero star?
Yeah. Is equal to zero. It is okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, then you just live off. In fact, the next model will have exactly that feature.
Right.
There's nothing that you have to have. Yes, it's a good question. Why did we carry it out? But the point is, okay. So I have said enough. I think we have spent enough time on this one. I want to get to the Caballero Peace and Booty. But the point, the second, let me just say that it's not visible here, but both the L and the access to the international markets, both of them matter. So you see, my second point was not only is Andre had asked a very good question, and we now have an answer to the question. That's very legitimate. The problem is we don't have enough dollar income to go and save abroad. But the other part of it is, it alleviates, obviously, when you get this dollar, these dollar bonds, that's like injecting liquidity into that picture that I drew in the last lecture. The supply of liquidity will increase, that will drop the Q. What it's going to do is relative to the equilibrium without the international market, it's going to drop Q and Q. There's first a Q, and then when the international guys come in, both prices will go down. Okay, so it becomes less expensive. So, for instance, the tax, you can think of it this way: the government doesn't have to tax as much. The tax distortion costs go down. So this is a good thing for the country. But domestic policy will matter. That is, this monetary policy that I described is going to just be the same. They could also, through that, sort of try to make this contingent on the shock. And there is a deeper question here that I don't want to go into, is you can ask, why isn't the government of Mexico, instead of those international guys, providing insurance? And the short answer is, it is costly for them, because that involves taxing. That's much, that involves giving the guys back money, consumers, when they may not, marginal return may be low, and then taxing them when maybe the marginal return is high from peso goods. Do you see? So they are themselves now facing already naturally a varying value for liquidity or marginal utility. And so that variation, if they are obviously not going to be able to provide sort of perfect insurance for them. So is that clear? All right. By the way, there are extensions of these malls where consumers can have also liquidity needs. It's an interesting question because it gets to these questions: how big your export sector should be. Russia may not be so interested. For Finland, small open economies, these are big questions. I mean, Finland has endlessly discussed this question about how much exports to really run.
Well, the generations of Russians have lived through a number of liquidity crises.
Yeah, but probably possibly for different reasons.
For all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
Including international.
So let me then go and
very fast.
what?
We tend to forget about it.
So let me call this the CK model. It's actually from that international and domestic collateral paper that got distributed, but I do a little simpler version. There's 3 periods. There's never, there are 2 kinds of people dealing with these problems. They are the infinite horizon guys. They are called macroeconomists, and then there are the three-period guys. They are called microeconomists dabbling in macro. It turns out you cannot make it into a macroeconomist unless you do an infinite horizon model. It's just not possible. And so we will forever be excluded from that group. And maybe that's a good thing. So they are here, this is a different model.
Three periods is much more complicated than infinite.
Well, it's true. That would be a good answer. But it turns out that often, sometimes it's not that way. But they want to calibrate things and they want to do that. So here, this is going to be a different model in that, in fact, in this model, international investors are doing nothing to. They talk about collateral, but in a certain sense, that's not what this is about. It's not about international collateral. It's not addressing the Andre question. But instead, what this is more about, the question is, all inputs are tradable goods. In fact, all goods are traded. So there is a single good, single tradable good. And so how are they going to get, now we have only one good, so how are they going to get into, international and domestic collateral? Well, there's going to be a difference of what counts as collateral for domestics is a bigger set of things than what counts as collateral for the international guys. So they are using this second idea. So foreigners, let me just make it charge zero interest. Just to make things, that's not the way the paper runs, but I want to make, in the interest of time, let's make it simple. So they lend at zero interest. This is dollar rates. And of course, preferences are just the same as I had before. Let me draw I'm just thinking of, maybe I draw the picture on the next slide. So let me jump a little ahead and say that collateral, I better draw a picture here. So let me draw the picture here. There's a dramatic departure from our modeling device, which is they have a non-linear cost function for investment. It's actually something that's convenient but otherwise it's a continuous investment. And this is date 2. At date 1 there is sort of a shock, a liquidity shock, and it happens to this is a continuum of firms, it happens to exactly half of them. So half intact, half distressed. Why half? Well, then aggregate uncertainty, well, that's not the only way, but the implication is that the aggregate uncertainty is eliminated because these are constant fractions of people. Idiosyncratic, you don't know which firm is intact and distressed, but you know it's always half and the other one. So this is not going to have any aggregate uncertainty. And I'm sorry I have to use a little different notation here, otherwise I get confused. I should have changed it. But this R here is really C1. And then, so they are going to get their C1 times I, as before. The distressed firms have to make another round of investment to actually get C1. So what they do is they get Ri, and this Ri is going to be the Z0, plus then they get R minus little r I, where little I is now less or equal to I. Notice this. So the distressed guys are just going to be hit by a shock such that if they do nothing, they are going to get R less than capital R. So they just lost, R, capital R minus little r I, but they can recover. So if they invest another, if they invest another round of I, so they double up, from the initial, then they are actually back to exactly capital RI. Okay, but it's a way of saying it is it's a slightly lower cost of investment than, a slightly lower return on investment than what the initial round was. So it's bad news. But we are going to assume that that's valuable. So R is less than capital R, and delta is, let me just write down because I'm going to use this. This is the incremental return on investment, and which is fully recovered if we go all the way to R, capital I. So that's the model. And so here is the collateral, which is kind of what can be as savings of what foreigners accept. Foreigners accept the W. Notice there's only one good, so it's not issue about tradable versus not. They accept W as for collateral, and which is the
No.
W, which is equal to endowment of unit mass of domestic aid. Maybe just like agents. It could be consumers, it could be somebody is, it could be government even, but there is kind of an endowment of unit mass of domestic agents delivered at day 2. So, think of one way of thinking about this is oil. And there's W of oil, and government has decided that they can commit this to foreigners. So that's one. That's the only thing these guys accept. And they notably they will not accept anything from this production technology. This is doing something they don't understand it. They are not going to take it as collateral for anything. And the domestic guys accept. Well, they accept the W, but of course they're going to not use it. They're going to domestic accept in addition RI. So they accept exactly this lower fraction here. So that's why I wrote it as Z0. They accept exactly that, even though you reinvest, they are not going to accept more than the RI. And even in the high state, there's not going to be anything. And so that's a simple way of saying that actually the liquidity shock, it's a way of dealing with this. It's a way of simplifying it. It's not the function of how much I invest in scale, at date 1 or anything like that. Let me add here that a third thing, which is that what was I going to say? There's an important thing I suddenly forgot. So they accept that. Idiosyncratic shock. So this is a big departure from not observed. So they are not going to allow contracts, unlike us, they are not going to allow contracts that are contingent on this idiosyncratic shock. So that's a critical departure. And by the way, they have a model they have a paper that writes, under certain assumptions, information assumptions, this is the best contract you can do. You cannot create a mechanism that has people reveal what their shock is, because it's kind of a diversion type model that I was alluding to last time. But let me already now say, because I probably don't get to it earlier, this is going in the direction of a bigger incomplete market. That is, now you are getting into that kind of very methodologically difficult ground where you are assuming incompleteness of markets and kind of saying, well, it depends, all what we assume. We feel like doing the cake thing and just assuming that's the only thing you cannot get, and that has much more discipline. It's kind of a much more, then we are arrow the brew on top of everything that's pledgeable. But we just have a slice. These guys are not out of the group because they are not going to allow things on the short. And that's kind of a little step down the slippery slope of incomplete markets. I hope, I don't know, are there any incomplete market guys here? I mean, that's a community of its own. They don't think of it as a slippery slope other than at least it's up. They maybe think of them as being at the bottom, you know, and walk up. But it is an important comment. You know, incomplete markets are clearly reality. How to model incomplete markets has sort of eluded. It's just the modeling approach doesn't have the discipline. So that's one defense for this slice. I don't know what you think. You are a general equilibrium guy, so you know you barely swallow it, but you do like to arrow the blue on pledgeable income, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So you see.
Why is that needed?
Because
we have a different pledgeability, that's enough, right?
Yes, we could do, but that was this modeling.
Exactly.
We have done it this way. So the reason they need it, because actually, I like actually this assumption in terms of its implications. But it's a dangerous assumption, is all I'm saying. But it actually is, their modeling is, generally speaking, the reason, what this does is basically you have to self-insure. That is, this leads to every firm has to arrange its own finance. So that's kind of extreme also. But I think it's not unreasonable to say that idiosyncratic shocks are hard to insure against, but they are banks. Banks give you credit lines. They are angel investors, you know, giving you more money when you know. It's not true that only aggregate shocks get insurance. But let's leave that aside. So foreigners don't accept that. So this means that the foreign debt, D0, which is debt from foreigners, at date 0. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say. Where is that? It's like it's not debt from foreign debt or foreign bonds. Let me write that. No, it is from sorry. Debt from foreigners. Date 0. You see, I have W coming in here. That's when I get, you know, the tradable good. That's the only resource in their model. And I have to get some tradable, you know, I have to get the investment going here. So my only way of even getting, my only chance here is that I go to the foreigners and I borrow money from them. That's the nature of this model. And so this is how much, and this is how much I'm going to save liquidity for date 1. The question is, how much do I invest and how much do I save for liquidity, just like we had it. But notice that in a sense, this is not about the investors having to have backed up claims. This is the classic problem of, you know, this is how much money I have coming for funding, and I'm splitting it up between how much I'm going to invest and how much I'm going to save for liquidity a day. Every firm does the same. So this is the decision for the firm. So this, of course, implies the scale I. I is equal to D0. And all firms, because identical. Every firm, same. Then comes date 1, and half of us are lucky and are intact, and half of us are distressed. So we have the same problem that, you know, we have all say W minus D0, and guess what? I would like to get I have to double, you know, I have to redo my investment, so to speak, I, to get going. And by the way, there's an assumption here that delta is bigger than 0. I should have said just than 1. So this is a positive thing still to do, okay? But it's not as lucrative as the initial investment. So we are sitting there, and the intact firms have liquidity. You know, they have this good, this investment good that's needed, but the guys that have been distressed, you know, have too little of it because they spend some of it on the good. But if we could do an insurance market, then we would all agree that day zero, something very simple, which is if you are in distress, I give you my W minus D0, and if you are intact and I'm in distress, we do the reverse. And there's a 50-50 chance. So, you know, first best is just to transfer money to the people who have. So first best is to transfer all W minus D0 to distress. But here comes the incomplete market thing in to the picture. We can't do that because we don't know who are intact and who are not. So we have to, just like incomplete market, we have to run a market at date one. And the way they run, so we are going to have to determine what happens to the market at date one. And I see I have to speed up a little bit. See, that's what blackboards or whiteboards does. It's all, but I think it sort of gives a chance to the listener, at least, if he or she wants to follow it better. So let me say that what they need is, the need for investment goods is I over 2, because half of them are distressed and it takes I to go all the way. And in order for there to be a financial crisis, it's got to be that they saved, you know, too little. So it's I over 2 that's you're looking for I over 2, and this is how much there is available. This is the total. This is both the distressed firms and the non-distressed. So this is how much the economy as a whole has saved, still has goods around. So we are going to run a little market where we look at the fact that, you know, there's so much supply of this investment good, and there is, what is it that the distressed firms can offer? And they did the unbelievable suggestion I should ask you questions. I said, no way, I'm not going to make myself really unpopular here. But the one thing you can offer is exactly what Sergei is pointing out. The domestics will accept collateral from the output. So the guys can offer to the domestics, even the distressed ones have something to offer, namely claims on the production tomorrow. And that, by the way, that's what's simplifying here, that doesn't depend at all on the investment level. That's what these guys are doing. And so we run the market, and maybe I should be get to the bottom line rather quickly, is that when you run the market, you'll see that basically what they have to offer is R of I over 2. This is the interior. There could be corner solutions, but I'm writing the internal in the equilibrium. And on the other side is it is W minus D0 over 2. And so this is going to generate an equilibrium. I'm sorry, W. There's an interest rate here that's missing. I'm going to write. I could write the price for these tradable goods. I'm going to write it as an interest rate, and so there's a 1 plus I. Let me call it dollars. So if you get $1 at date 1, or one of these tradable goods at date 1, you have to pay back 1 plus I dollars at date 2. That's the charge. It may be that I dollars is 0, and then it's just the same as in the international market. But if there's a shortage of this tradable good, this is going to actually boost up the price. So notice this is not a liquidity premium at all. This is about, the guys actually offering these goods. And if I draw back, quickly the pricing, it's actually, the picture looks very similar to, actually it goes down to zero. Because I chose it to do zero. As it goes down to zero, this is kind of the demand as a function of I, and the highest price you are willing to pay is delta minus 1, because that's the value of reinvestment. So you're not going to go and pay anything more for this, and then so this is what makes delta equals 1 plus I star, and then at the low end, as I said, this is 0. And then there's a supply function here, which is W minus D0 over, I think it's over 2, or then it's, sorry, it's either over 2 or not over 2. I don't want to bother. But the point is that, the supply here, if here it's how the logic works, if we spend more on the initial investment, D0 is higher, so it eats into this, what remains, so that's going to push this thing here in. There's going to be higher interest rates, so it's actually more worthwhile to save till tomorrow, because I'm going to get this 1 plus I dollar return per dollar of liquidity that I saved. Eventually that's going to, if it goes too high, I'm going to be driven back, and I'm looking at an equilibrium that's in the middle here, where the consideration of, I can either invest by saving and then hoping that I'm intact and then selling off, or in fact I don't have to hope that I'm intact. Even if I'm distressed, the saving is valuable. But the intact case is the one that's impacted by this I star, and then on the other hand, I do of course want to invest, if I don't put some capital. So that's kind of the simple mechanism of choosing long versus short term. And the key point is that this is, the key point is that the rate is such that this is between delta minus 1 in some instances, 0, which is really the I, let me call it I star for the international rate of interest. So let me make it, this model's main point is going to be that this is the value of reinvestment. That's the marginal return of reinvestment. But because they don't have enough collateral, these guys, because there may be a shortage of collateral, domestic collateral, that's RI here. There may not be enough of it because they have invested too little, or it's not even too little. It's just in the balance of things. There's too little of it to get up to the price delta minus 1. There's going to be the people who save liquidity are not going to get enough of a return. It's actually a classic problem, by the way, for strategic reserves. People don't invest enough in oil because they fear that the time that oil really is needed, these guys are so poor, because they're spending, you see that you can think of it as somewhat downward sloping supply. But in reality, in the case of oil, the government says this is how much you can charge for oil because the population is just in uproar. So you never invest as a private investor enough in strategic oil because you are not going to capture the marginal value of oil. So this is just the same. Because the price in the date 1 market typically will not reach the full value of liquidity at that date, these guys are going to underinvest in the liquidity and therefore not capture. I actually, given the time, I think I had an expression. It's kind of interesting. It works from the both sides. It's both when you make the intact calculation as the distressed, it's both the case that you go this branch, it turns out there's too little value from saving liquidity, and the same applies for the distressed firm, but for opposite reason. In the intact firm, the problem is that the value of selling is too high, and in the distressed firm is of course reversed. It's just that the cost is too cheap. It's for the distressed firm, so that you are getting liquidity too cheaply. You should be paying delta minus 1 when you are distressed, but you don't have the money, so you get away with little. So on both sides, basically that pushes us to underinvest in liquidity, which I said could be interpreted actually as saving too little dollars. It's the inverse of the saving. So you are not putting enough dollars, you are just borrowing too much, and that's a very classic problem actually among open economies. It's the frustration. So let me say this model is very different in some ways, but there are many variants of this model, by the way. This is not the only one. They have written at least 4 or 5 papers on this very same thing, but kind of variants of it. And but the bottom line is that this they view as one of the sources of a crisis. Except there's a little problem here. Everything is foreseeable because there's no aggregate risk. And so I think they are working now on yet another paper where, or maybe they did already, I haven't really kept count of that, where they bring in aggregate risk, but of course as soon as you have aggregate risk you have to deal with, now you do have to deal with insurance markets. Because aggregate risk, you're not going to get away with just assuming we can't have insurance against aggregate risk. So that needs to be done, but I don't think fundamentally aggregate risk is going to have some impact, perhaps alleviating it, that is, people will be more inclined to save in dollars now, but in order to protect against the aggregate risk, which can be priced properly at date zero, because it isn't determined by some financial value, you see, so that price is going to be right, it's going to push things in the right direction, but not necessarily, I don't think it will resolve this basic problem. And then secondly, what they do in another paper is they look at, from which, by the way, this simplified model is taken, is they show that sterilization, which is a common way in which countries try, or governments try to deal with this over-borrowing problem, is they sterilize. But these guys, sterilize means that they buy dollar bonds and they give them domestic bonds instead. They show in this paper, for reasons that I don't have the time to go into, actually the sterilization is either neutral or actually damaging in this model. So sterilization is not the solution to this problem at all. And so the right instruments to deal with this problem is somehow to either directly, to try to deal with the fact that people borrow too much. You could, of course, charge a premium of some sort and take that with you and hoard some dollars and then redistribute to distressed firms if you can identify them. Or then, in some manner or another, affect the allocation between the initial investment scale, which is too big here, relative to the investment in liquidity, which is too small. So this is a pecuniary externality. So let me actually, this is it exactly on the minute. So I'm going to stop here. I was going to say that I was going to draw some conclusions about this model in general, but I think you have had enough of me. That I won't torture you with that. But these are, at least I hope you have got an idea about, that this is a sequence of thinking coming out of this little idea of there's a wedge that cannot be pledged, looking at how it affects asset prices, looking at how it affects credit rationing, the idea of credit rationing being an insurance, this is a diamond dipping kind of insurance idea, but maybe in a simpler context. Could put, incidentally, consumers could be put in here and they would have very low zeros, probably Z0, they don't have any production, you could do that. Wouldn't change things very much. And then I think the critical ideas of today, which are more harder somehow to grasp, is that if entrepreneurs cannot pledge much, you are in a capital poor society, and that creates a reverse problem of insuring. It creates a problem for insurance instruments in production, and you cannot carry out the production plans the way you plan. And then secondly, that you can go to international investors, you can go to government. International investors are not a solution per se, because you don't have usually the dollars it takes to go to international investors. And secondly, the government as business is, apart from the fact that they can abuse money in general, they actually, taxation costs money. So it's not a costless route.
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of minutes for questions. Any questions here?
Probably my question is exactly what you do not like to discuss. Assume that in the country we have very large foreign exchange reserves. Doesn't mean that it is not reasonable for a firm to take care about liquidity in dollars.
Say that again. So you are taking Russia as an example of a country that has big foreign reserves.
Russia, China.
Now, Norway is a good other example. I got that same question. They asked the question this way: what should we do with our dollars? And I offered the obvious first answer, which is give it to me. And they didn't like that answer. I didn't have credible. But you had some other.
There is a huge collateral.
Yeah.
For the whole country.
Yeah.
Does it mean that a firm should not take care about collateral in dollars? Just keep liquidity in rubles?
They could. I mean, the problem with ruble, I think, that's sort of what Chinese entrepreneurs are forced to do, because they are not allowed to access. I mean, you can access the international market. They can't. So one way of looking at what the Chinese central bank is doing is they have all these claims, they have sterilized in massive amounts of this. Give us your dollars, you get our, yuan bonds in exchange. But then they have invested the dollar reserves they have it sort of somewhere invested so that it's like a secure. So it's kind of collateralizing the bonds. And in that sense, yes, if you can trust your government, then doing rubles is just fine. As a matter of fact, doing rubles might be better, because if your government would be really smart and do the kind of monetary policy and sort of contingent liquidity supply that I was talking about, if they were really benevolent as government, they could do that with rubles. They can't do that with dollars because they don't have, at least they can't. They have a much easier time with rubles. The problem is that a lot of us don't trust our governments. But I tell you this much for Finland. I think Finland actually, I'm maybe the only guy in Finland I'm not even in Finland, but these devaluations from this perspective, in my eyes, is all about insurance and moving around money from the idea poor to the idea rich when it's needed. And people, I think this is the way it is. And by the way, it's easy enough to write models that have that characteristic. But people don't believe that even in Finland. They don't think government is responsible. But I think it's the central bank, for which you have one less member, unfortunately. It's how responsible the central bank is.
It depends on the volume of reserves. Of course,
yeah, but you have plenty of reserves. You could do a lot. It's not clear that it's best, in the hands of government. But I don't know, Russia. I shouldn't speak, but these are kind of generic concerns you see. Mexico is having a lot of problems. They have a lot of oil. They don't trust the government. The government spends oil in manners that are not in accordance with these theories.
I have a question actually not about the model, but about the intuition about why the United States now has current account deficit, and it is because other countries want to save and they need some instruments to save their earnings, and they use United States treasury bills. But the question is, at the end, if there is a problem of maximization of infinite-lived consumer or short-lived consumer, they need to repay the trade deficit at the end. So what will be the implication of your story to the United States? A quite a long history of current account deficit.
Well, let me just say, it's not my story. This is also Ricardo. So you should go on Ricardo Caballero's webpage where he has a paper. It's an infinite horizon paper because it's a macro club. He's trying to get entry into the macro club in a bigger way. But it is a paper that first of all establishes you don't ever have to repay. You know, if you're in short, the answer is you can run a deficit forever, but not a 7% deficit. That's not sustainable. But you will get back in balance by reducing it. I don't remember what his estimates were, because if you have a sufficiently good growth rate, you know, it's just going to be, all you have to go is sort of get with the deficit below the growth rate. As I recall, it was just that simple. But, you know, basically you can sustain it because you are staying within a percentage of you know, what the total indebtedness can be. You know, you are talking about the problem of running into insolvency, and you can avoid insolvency by just having a small. So the answer is first. That doesn't answer yet the question of how do you get down to that rate. But basically, what they argue is going to happen slowly, because the dollars are going to, the demand for these savings instruments are going to keep going, and there are all sorts of complicated things. But let me say what I think is so compelling about that story relative to the traditional story, which this is actually elementary supply and demand. You know, it's really a question: is it that demand has gone up, and that's why, you know, is the demand for consumption, American consumption, has it gone up, which then pushes, you know, draws in the foreign investors to finance it? Or it could be investment or consumption, but people like to say consumption. What will happen to the price when it's a demand shock? If I want more, the price goes up. Look at the evidence. The price has kept consistently coming down. And that's, you know, it has come down from the 95, I should have brought my slides because I gave a talk just about it. You know, it just, interest rates has just been coming down. The price at which these guys are getting it is cheaper and cheaper, which is why they mortgage more and more of their houses, or did before. It just changed, by the way, in this March. I mean, now the housing market suddenly looks soft, and it's already going down. You know why? Because I paid off my loan, contingent loan. So I paid it actually at the peak, and now, you know, it's Murphy's Law. So this is how powerful I am. Had I decided to pay it another date, you know, it would have gone later. So it just seems so obvious to me. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. But it just is very hard to argue how can interest rates on the, you know, and the exchange, nothing happened to the exchange rate, the world accumulating finance, and more than half of all the money flowing into the US is not government money. It's private money. So, you know, we have heard the stories about how the Chinese government, etc., etc. But it's not the Chinese government that is the key player. In fact, more of it is private money. So, you know, we could be wrong. I'm talking like a little religious sect here. But, you know, we could be wrong, but at least we had a very compelling. The other side has not told a consistent story, and this is by the way not these models, but it's just it is the model I described in that you can look at international trade and you realize that it's not just about trading goods; it's also about investing in collateral, you know, in foreign collateral to share risks and, you know, get, you know, the first model I was describing. And so, yes, that model could be sort of developed into exactly this story, that suddenly if one country has a lot of these collateralizable assets and has an easy time producing it, so they can move Z0 up. You know, it costs something, but if the cost is low and if these other guys need collateral, they will do it. That's the home loan market story. And of course, the current account is exactly the opposite of how much money you need. So, you know, they are going to take some payment for, you know, these guys, they are giving them liabilities, they got to get something for it. You know, they get Chinese sweaters and you know, all that, you got to get paid. So, you know, that's how you consume. But I certainly belong also to the people who believe that it's not going to crash. I mean, the reason it's not going to crash, first of all, because the whole imbalance actually is in the dollar zone. So, devaluations and things like that, I mean, you could say that, well, then it's really going to crash because no matter how much we depreciate the dollar, nothing is going to happen to the deficit. But actually it is the fact that these dollar guys, they are all in the same boat. They are not going to let this crash. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And by the way, a third thing is the US is in a lovely position actually. This is not a US problem. This is a Europe problem. Because US people, they owe dollars to foreigners. It's a pretty nice thing because you can just decide how much the dollar is worth. It's like I'm owing you, some Finnish marks or something. I can just devalue it if you want to put it that way. And this collapse of the dollar is just 10% drop in the dollar wipes out 4.5% of the 4.5 percentage point of their debt. They are now, I think, at 21% of GDP in external debt. 4.5% is estimated to drop if the dollar goes another 10% down. And let's do, 40%. And we don't have any debt anymore. So, it's a pretty. They are sitting pretty well in this thing, and the Europeans keep criticizing them and whining about them for a very good reason. It's big trouble for Europe. That's what it is. Collapsing the dollar, they are not going to get their monies back. The Chinese, you see it, it's just, that's how I see it. I think I'm an American by now. I've been
You're at least dollarized.
Just if I can continue on this point, so you seem to suggest, or at least in the first lecture, you suggested that the origins of the U.S. trade deficit are not with the U.S. policies, but it's with other countries' willingness to accumulate reserves because they need this liquidity, right? Liquidity. Now, first of all, I still don't understand why it's. Are you saying it's bad for the United States? And second, if it is bad.
No, I'm saying that I don't think it's bad for the United States. No.
But then the U.S. has a choice, right? U.S. can prohibit the inflow. They can introduce the tax on the treasury bills, right? Then should
perhaps that, but they can probably do something. They can sort of slow down the economy, or do something.
They can accumulate the reserves themselves in euros and then underprice their own currency, right?
Well, let me just say here, Europe is exactly doing what you are suggesting. They can prohibit the inflow of these. Europe has pretty good savings instruments. But what have these guys been doing? They have been actually running, tough part, making sure this economy does not grow. And then the Ricardo Caballero's paper shows Chinese money could go to Europe, and it could go, or Russian money for that matter, could go to Europe, or it could go to the US, roughly speaking. Which country will get the bulk of it? Well, the one that grows much faster, because it creates much more collateral at a much higher rate. Its assets are appreciating, so it can absorb much more collateral than. Much more. It can offer much more savings instruments than Europe. So Europe is doing just what you are saying. They are saying, let's not get these Chinese investments into, or purchases. So they are not in that business. Of
They
selling.
also prohibit of running large budget deficit in the Europe compared to the United States.
Well,
By the growth pact, they cannot allow deficit to be above 3%. And the United States, it's fine.
They don't allow their consumers to consume, and they don't allow their government to, run deficits. But otherwise, they are very happy.
But that was my question. I sort of want to question Christina, but anyway, remember Clinton had something like balanced budget amendment, or they were trying to balance budget.
Newt Gingrich, not Clinton.
And then this whole thing started after Bush forgot about the balancing budget. So is it a coincidence that Chinese started to ask more money after Bush forgot about this balanced budget, or what is the?
Well, it's the same. You can see the government as one of the consumers, and it's become very cheap. I mean, that's not the reason they run the debt. It's an old Republican trick to just run big deficits so that they have to cut the spending. Later. That's That's Reagan's. I don't know if Reagan was the first, but he certainly did it in a big way. So he was a savvy politician, actually. It was but it would come, even if they were responsible, it would interest rates very low. Government gets money for nothing in the US right now. So, it's going to feed it. So the servicing this debt, I mean, if interest rates went up, things would start to look a lot more ugly. I actually cut you off, so let me... Sorry about that.
So the ratio of reserves to GDP for the whole world in recent, say, 50 years increased from 2% to about 8%. Is there anything to say about it with regards to to the picture that you are drawing? So should there be a particular debtor country that provides other countries with the instruments, with the financial instruments, to place their liquidity in?
Yeah, I don't know about reserves. We are getting into territory where I have to take off my masqueraded international expertise, and I'm not an expert in that sense. So I have a continuing interest in reading, trying to keep myself semi-literate on these matters. Reserves, I don't know why they have gone up so much, but I think possibly, I don't know, if you take out China and Japan, they come from these imbalances, and I didn't realize what happens to why the aggregate has gone up so much. I don't have an immediate answer to that question, but let me say the imbalances have gone consistently up. So the average imbalance, and this is not weighted average, this is just taking average in the EU, actually in the OECD, the average imbalance is 6%. Now, of course, the problem in some sense, if you are on the current account nervousness side, is that one of the big guys is United States. So what does it matter that a little country like Estonia runs a little current account deficit of 15%? That's irrelevant. Or that that Finland runs a little surplus of 3 or 4%. Doesn't help much to. So, but I'm just saying that the average balance, you take every country, you just count them equally. One country, one unit weight, it's 6%. So the problem in some sense is that it's a big country that's running 6% or now 7%. That's what makes people nervous. By the way, I should say, I'm not happy about the American imbalance because of the budget deficit. I think the flip side of it is not to say that, well, they are just what. I think there are coordination problems. I mean, we have never run an experiment like this, that what happens if somebody really feeds you, money sort of. As I said, I have a home mortgage request every day on my phone. There's a guy saying, don't you want more money? And, we can offer 2% or 3% initially, and then they go up. You are really being pushed money. And that comes, in my belief, that's what I believe, it's coming from the fact that there is a lot of money coming out that's looking for savings, and they are trying to tell me, create some savings instruments. We have things, we have the money, just give us an asset where we can put it. That's the story I'm telling.
So it's impossible to resist the lure, yes, but everyone is asking you to create the instrument.
Well, I did, of course, something totally stupid, which was I paid off my loan. So in this world, I'm a criminal because I just had a liquid asset and I just eliminated it. And that's not a good thing for liquidity in this. And of course, it was maybe personally stupid. I am worried about what happens to the budget deficit in the US, and I'm worried, despite what I said, I'm worried about asset bubbles in Russia, probably Russia. All the, these guys are running big account surpluses. I think that makes, they are looking for savings instruments even though they are scarce, Chinese real estate. What did I hear about Moscow? I mean, it costs more than Boston now or something. There's something that's not right about that. And it's part of this kind of savings club that's pushing it up. And I think there's a reason to be worried about that. So I don't want to say, I just want to say that the mechanism is not the one that people peddle, which is, irresponsible Americans wanting to, just consume and consume and consume. they may be a little irresponsible, but if somebody offers that cheap money, and then you can write down the debt by depreciating the dollar, this is a hard thing not to take.